supporting supposedly pro-Palestine candidates, which Abdel al-Sayed obviously isn't. I mean, he's a liberal Zionist, and he's only going to get worse and worse and worse the closer and closer that he gets to power. I mean, he's already accepting endorsements from people who have literally genocided Palestinians, right? But to them, that doesn't matter, because all they really care about is what it signals for American domestic politics, what it signals for where these people might stand on the issues of getting like slightly better welfare and like healthcare for Americans. All that matters to them is like getting money out of their politics, you know, it being a signal that this guy will defend their reproductive rights. Free Palestine means free Palestine, right? It does not and it should not be shorthand for other things, because when you turn it into a shorthand for those other things, what ends up happening is this. Its original meaning is just completely dropped, to the point where no one really gives a shit about whether or not the people who espouse supposedly pro-Palestinian views are really even trying to do anything about it. This is something that we have to fight against, right? This is something that we should be seriously vigilant about, because, well, I mean, fight against it might be a bit late for that. It's already kind of happened, but it could get worse, I suppose. We can't let the liberation of the Palestinian people just become a thing that lip service is paid to as like a domestic American culture war issue that is like sort of used as a proxy to mean, look, I swear up and down, I'm going to fight for Medicare for all and for your reproductive rights if you vote for me on the Democratic Party ticket, if you grit your teeth and ignore the fact that I am in an open alliance with Kamala Harris and Barack Obama. Like, we've moved to the point now where people talk about like supposedly freeing Palestine and being anti-Zionist and all this stuff, but it's not even within the context of Palestine itself. They're just mentioning it as a empty signifier for completely unrelated issues. Honestly, though, maybe they are related in a way, because, you know, free healthcare for Americans, all these other, like, welfare benefits for Americans, those are the fruits of imperialism, and the Palestinians are the victims of it. So, like, turning Palestine into a meaningless signifier that just says maybe slightly a little bit about someone's position on those issues might actually be detrimental to Palestinian liberation, even just outside of how appropriating Palestinian liberation for that purpose is already very detrimental to it. And Chubbo Trap House, like of everyone, they get no excuse it for me on the Democratic Party ticket if you grit your teeth and ignore the fact that I am in an open alliance with Kamala Harris and Barack Obama. Like, we've moved to the point now where people talk about like supposedly freeing Palestine and being anti-Zionist and all this stuff, but it's not even within the context of Palestine itself. They're just mentioning it as a empty signifier for completely unrelated issues. Honestly, though, maybe they are related in a way, because, you know, free healthcare for Americans, all these other like welfare benefits for Americans, those are the fruits of imperialism, and the Palestinians are the victims of it. So like turning Palestine into a meaningless signifier that just says maybe slightly a little bit about someone's position on those issues might actually be detrimental to Palestinian liberation, even just free healthcare for Americans, all these other like welfare benefits for Americans, those are the fruits of imperialism, and the Palestinians are the victims of it. So like turning Palestine into a meaningless signifier that just says maybe slightly a little bit about someone's position on those issues might actually be detrimental to Palestinian liberation, even just outside of how appropriating Palestinian liberation for that purpose is already very detrimental to it. And Chubbo Trap House, like of everyone, they get no excuse for this shit. That podcast itself was born out of like the 2016 election, outside of how appropriating Palestinian liberation for that purpose is already very detrimental to it. And Chubbo Trap House, like of everyone, they get no excuse for this shit. That podcast itself was born out of like the 2016 election and supporting Bernie Sanders and such, and the victory of Donald Trump and all that stuff. That is where they became famous. They have seen the last 10 years of American electoral politics, of Democratic Party entryism, of how it's complete bullshit. They, of all people, have no excuse for peddling this sort of shit. This is approximately their 50th time falling for it in the course of 10 years. And they're just open about how, to them, it's not even falling for it. It's actually a good thing that this anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movement has been appropriated to be little more than a sort of culture war issue that signals where you stand in American domestic politics.
く来たね。今日は洒落てるじゃないか。ごきげんよう。 また会ったね。また会ったね。私と一曲踊ろうよ。
And in order to make Argentina fit that image, people have been spreading a lot of falsehoods, like Elliot Sang does here. And they have been applying is, okay? It's very extensive. He clearly knows a lot about this topic now, way more than he did a week ago before he made it. Way more than he did a week ago when he made a video based off TikToks. You know, I don't think you can really learn that much in a week of research, especially when it's research being made to just get your bag off a social media trend rather than for any honest reason. But, you know.
In fact, I'm going to do more tab saving and research than I have in any video. This is probably going to be my longest video, just because I want to prove that I'm doing research here, that I'm not just talking out of my butt, and that I'm not interested in waging a hate campaign against one particular group of people based off of viral posts and angry social media discourse.
Ooh, that's not going to age too well anyway. So I'm going to go over a bunch of things here, but I think the most emblematic example of how little this guy knows what he is talking about here and how he's clearly just wading into a topic that he doesn't actually understand is his bizarre claim that there is a Hamas in Argentina.
Being mentioned the most in this conversation. When we talk about the Hamas of Argentina, maybe we can talk about that, and then we can also talk about the Mapuches in this conversation.
Okay, so there's a Hamas in Argentina. Let's look into that, guys. Let's look into the Hamas of Argentina.
So remember when I told you about how there's an Argentinian Hamas? What I really mean is that there's a Mapuche Hamas who lingers as a Hamas-like figure in Argentinian politics. That is that the Mapuche people have resistance groups.
Now, he unfortunately edited out the worst of his claims about this supposed Mapuche Hamas here after I left a comment pointing out that it literally he unfortunately edited out the worst of his claims about this supposed Mapuche Hamas here after I left a comment pointing out that it literally does not exist. But the gist of it was that he said that there's this Mapuche group who do like armed struggle against the Argentine government. And he constructed like this whole grand narrative in this video about like how, I guess, racist Argentina is based on this supposed like indigenous resistance group fighting the state. What he claimed was that there is this group called the Ancestral Mapuche Resistance in Argentina. And he used this as an example of there being like extant armed indigenous resistance groups to the Argentine state today. Now, the problem is, even if you read just the Wikipedia article on this, you will see that this is only an alleged insurgent organization that is suspected of being a psyop by the intelligence services, which was played up by the right-wing US-backed president Mauricio Macri, who was president from 2015 until 2019. And that's a great example of how you actually do need to understand the Argentine context before you talk about Argentina, because what he's doing here is basically transposing the armed Mapuche groups that do exist, that is in Chile, onto Argentina, where they don't exist. And this also kind of shows like his just complete lack of understanding about the Argentine context, because anyone like even center-left in Argentina is aware of the way that right-wing governments like invent evil Mapuche terrorist groups that don't actually exist in order to try and defend their landowning buddies from Mapuche land claims. It's a sort of thing that like even center-left in Argentina is aware of the way that right-wing governments like invent evil Mapuche terrorist groups that don't actually exist in order to try and defend their landowning buddies from Mapuche land claims. It's a sort of thing that you would know all about with even just a slight inkling of knowledge of the Argentine present-day political context. You know, kind of contradicting his idea that you do not need to know anything about Argentina on its own terms to be able to provide an accurate analysis of it, right? And this is another example of how even in two contexts that are quite similar, that is Chile and Argentina, you do actually need to understand them on their own terms. Now, this immediately sort of shot out for me because I don't like to talk about this sort of thing. I don't want people to know anything about me, but I did archival work before in support of Mapuche land claims. I went through an example of how even in two contexts that are quite similar in any political context, kind of contradicting his idea that you do not need to know anything about Argentina on its own terms to be able to provide an accurate analysis of it, right? And this is another example of how even in two contexts that are quite similar, that is Chile and Argentina, you do actually need to understand them on their own terms. Now, this immediately sort of shot out for me because I don't like to talk about this sort of thing. I don't want people to know anything about me, but I did archival work before in support of Mapuche land claims. I went through historical archives looking for some sort of evidence of historical Mapuche ownership or occupation of Mapuche land claims. I went through historical archives looking for some sort of evidence of historical Mapuche ownership or occupation of certain parcels of land in order to back up Mapuche land claims in court. And the reason why I was helping out with this is because Argentina, different to Chile, does not actually have the sort of Mapuche groups that Chile has for a particular reason, and that is that Argentina did something that Chile land claims in court. And the reason why I was helping out with this is because Argentina, historical archives looking for some sort of evidence of historical Mapuche ownership or occupation of certain parcels of land in order to back up Mapuche land claims in court. And the reason why I was helping out with this is because Argentina, different to Chile, does not actually have the sort of Mapuche groups that Chile has for a particular reason, and that is that Argentina did something that Chile has yet to do, which is that in 1994 it had a constitutional reform that legally recognized the pre-existing claim to indigenous lands of indigenous people in Argentina. Article 75, Annex 17, recognizes the ethnic and cultural pre-existence of the Argentine indigenous people. So what that did is this created a legal framework through which indigenous people can claim land in the courts based on ownership/occupancy before Argentina was even an independent nation. This is something that they tried to do in Chile with the 2023 constitutional referendum, which included provisions like this for Chile, but unfortunately it was defeated at the referendum. So the reason why in Argentina you do not have the sorts of Mapuche groups that you do have in Chile is because Argentina created a legal framework through which indigenous people can claim land based on occupancy and historical connection. Whereas Chile does not have this sort of judicially ingrained process. Instead, it has a government indigenous agency that is responsible for buying land, just random land anywhere, and giving it to indigenous people, which is obviously not the same sort of thing as this sort of constitutional right to native title. So that's the reason you have in Chile, is because Argentina created a legal framework through which indigenous people can claim land based on occupancy and historical connection. Whereas Chile does not have this sort of judicially ingrained process. Instead, it has a government indigenous agency that is responsible for buying land, just random land anywhere, and giving it to indigenous people, which is obviously action. Whereas Chile does not have this sort of judicially ingrained process. Instead, it has a government indigenous agency that is responsible for buying land, just random land anywhere, and giving it to indigenous people, which is obviously not the same sort of thing as this sort of constitutional right to native title. So that's the difference in these two contexts. In Chile, you have people who basically got fed up at the complete lack of any real mechanism for them to claim their land under a legal framework, versus Argentina, where there have been quite a few successful Mapuche land claims, particularly under the previous government, where large swaths of land were finally awarded to a lot of Mapuche groups who had been attempting to attain this land via the judicial system for quite a long time. And this is basically the only good thing that the previous government did. It was a shit show aside from this, but they, for example, awarded 24,000 hectares in San Rafael in Mendoza province to a Mapuche community and 5,000 hectares in San Luis to a different Mapuche community. So, we have different contexts here. You can't simply apply what's happening in Chile to Argentina, let alone what's happening in the United States to Argentina. Now, if you did want to talk about incredible problematic actions in Argentina being taken against the Mapuche community. What I would have talked about here is the government of Javier Milei attempting to revoke those land awards from the different Mapuche communities who had finally been awarded land after many years of reclaiming it. But instead, what we did get is an American spreading basically Argentine right-wing propaganda of the idea that there is a Mapuche terrorist organization that is behind these land claims. He was taking made-up right-wing bullshit that is one of the main talking points of the Argentine right-wing against Mapuche land claims, as if it was just true, and spreading it, and basing like an entire 10 to 15 segment of his video where he covers the Mapuche struggle off that. It's ridiculous. Luckily, in Argentina, the still independent Mapuche communities have not felt the need to take up arms, because the 1994 constitutional framework has given them a means to reclaim land for their communities. Though with what Milei has been doing, perhaps this will change. But luckily, it is constitutionally enshrined, so they do at least have a judicial means to contest this sort of thing that he's been doing. And what usually happens in Argentina when governments flagrantly violate the constitution, which happens a whole fucking lot, particularly with Milei, is that this sort of thing is appealed to the courts, and a year or two down the line, inevitably the court finds that the government was in the wrong and the situation is rectified. Though, obviously, the fact that they have to fight for it is ridiculous, because the Constitution is very clear on this. The Constitution is very clear. And the work that I did with Mapuche communities was under the constitutional framework, because Mapuches in particular have issues here, because there was a process, a 200-ish year process called the Araucanization, where a lot of the indigenous cultures of southern Argentina were sort of subsumed by Mapuche culture. And this can make it kind of difficult to tell who is entitled
Настя, тебе вообще пофиг, да, что я на задний фон под импонаду включил и слушаю его. Лексан. Тебе пофиг, что твой стримера смотрит во время стрима. Типа, главное, чтобы что-то на заднем фоне было, да? Дарья Сергеевна из папиных дочек или кто это? Кто такая Дарья Сергеевна? Дарья, я не знаю. Ну, значит, если тебе пофиг, что я на стриме слушаю чужой стрим, ну и хорошо. Я согласен.
to what land, because, you know, everyone is basically Mapuche, but also they all have these like subgroup identities because they used to be different groups of indigenous people under different names that lived in different places. So it's a lot easier for land title claims to be made by groups that were simply in the same place for a very long time than it is for these Mapuche groups, who were subsumed into a wider culture and thus often lack sort of material evidence of their long stand to different places. So it's a lot easier for land title claims to be made by groups that were simply in the same place for a very long time than it is for these Mapuche groups, who were subsumed into a wider culture and thus often lack sort of material evidence of their long-standing claims to their land. Something that I was difficult to tell who is entitled to what land, because, you know, everyone is basically Mapuche, but also they all have these like subgroup identities because they used to be different groups of indigenous people under different names that lived in different places. So it's a lot easier for land title claims to be made by groups that were simply in the same place for a very long time than it is for these Mapuche groups, who were subsumed into a wider culture and thus often lack sort of material evidence of their long-standing claims to their land. Something that I was helping out with. Now, I want to cover his treatment of the Argentina black genocide idea here, which he handles in a very cop-out sort of way. And the way that he deals with the Argentina black genocide narrative is he says, well, it did commit black genocide, though as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, like every other country in the Americas.
Now we're going to...
And says, well, it did commit black genocide, though as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, like every other country in the Americas.
Now we're going to talk about the most controversial part of this, which is the idea of Argentina having committed a black genocide. As Reina asks, what happened to black Argentinians? Was it a genocide or something else? That's what I really want to know. A lot of people are wondering this. What I'm going to say is this. There was a black genocide. It wasn't specifically Argentina that did it. There was a black genocide. It wasn't specifically Argentinians that did it. It wasn't specifically Argentina that did it. All of the Americas are based in a black genocide. But we don't talk about the transatlantic slave trade as having been a genocide.
So the problem here is that this isn't what anyone's talking about. When people talk about black genocide in Argentina, they're not talking about the transatlantic slave trade. They're talking about something specific to Argentina. They claim that, you know, Argentina killed all of its black people, or either consciously via massacres, which, as I've gone over on my main channel video on the topic, is something that has been claimed before by a lot of Americans, or through like sneaky, subtle means, like they claim that they were like intentionally killed via disease in epidemics, or they were sent to like the front line of wars to die. So being like, well, yeah, they did do a genocide, but so did every other country via the transatlantic slave trade. It's all well and good, but that's not what anyone's talking about. It sounds like you're just trying to affirm, you know, the sort of person that's going to watch this video wants to hear, to sort of sneakily get around the fact that if you honestly dealt with the evidence for the things that people have actually been claiming on social media, you'd have to say, yeah, that stuff didn't actually happen. And you can see that very clearly when he does get down to actually trying to deal with the evidence for this. And here is how he breaches this topic.
So, as you may know, about a third of Buenos Aires' population in the early 19th century was black. Like 30%, many people guess. This paper, An African Tree Produces White Flowers, has some really important details about how it happened. And it's based on some historicism that has popped up, especially in the past 50 years, that essentially has revised the narrative that Argentina committed a black genocide.
So the problem is that previously, before this research, there wasn't a narrative that Argentina has committed a black genocide. That wasn't really a widespread thing that anyone was really talking about. What happened in the last 50 years is that historians like looked into the question of like, oh, why was there this percentage-wise a fairly large population of black people in Buenos Aires back then, but there isn't now, and they looked into like all these possible explanations for them, etc. So it wasn't that they were like revising history, it's rather that they were looking into that question, they came up with explanations for why.
You see, in response to seeing this massive decline in the black population, having been 30% of Buenos Aires in 1810 to now being less than a percentage point of the Argentinian population today. There's 300,000 people who identify as black Argentine or Afro-Argentino today. The original explanation...
To be clear here, 300,000 is a much larger population than there ever has been at any point in the history of Argentina. The black Argentine population at its height was around 100,000 people. Now that's of course an estimation, it's a little bit of guesswork because we don't actually have a census post-independence at the height of the black population where we could really know. We only really have reliable census for Buenos Aires. But around 100,000 is a fair estimate, so it's 3 times larger than it was back. Much larger population than there ever has been at any point in the history of Argentina. The black Argentine population at its height was around 100,000 people. Now that's of course an estimation, it's a little bit of guesswork because we don't actually have a census post-independence at the height of the black population where we could really know. We only really have reliable census for Buenos Aires. But around 100,000 is a fair estimate, so it's 3 times larger than it was back then. You know, looking at percentages and then acting like, oh, the percentage went down, so something untoward must have happened, really doesn't tell you the whole story, especially when numerically the population is still higher. Because there are many explanations for why the population could go down as a percentage that aren't all particularly nefarious.
And the one that has become popular or revitalized on social media was that Argentina committed a black genocide. It systematically erased black people from the census. It put black people who were impoverished.
I don't see how removing a census category, for example, would be genocide. I don't think that meets the definition of genocide. I would hope that we've moved past using the term genocide way too lightly after we've all seen what's happening in Gaza, and changing census categories really does not change anything on the actual ground, especially not in the 19th century, where few people gave a single shit about any census, okay? The average person in the 19th century wasn't even meaningfully under the jurisdiction of the Argentine government, let alone gave much of a shit about if a census category changed or not.
In war, they put them on the front lines and subjected them most specifically to diseases so that the black population could be reduced as much as possible. This was the narrative. And what happened is at the later part of the 20th century, a historian named Andrews, and then a later group of historians discussing Argentinian history, actually found that it was not quite that simple, or it was not quite that way. And the term black genocide has since become more controversial, and in fact is probably not the best description of what the Argentinian government did from the 19th and 20th centuries.
What he said there about like how, you know, he doesn't think that apart from the transatlantic slave trade, that what happened in Argentina, you know, should be called a genocide, or that, you know, he doesn't think at least that the label applies for himself. It just contradicted by himself very directly, where at the end of this video, near his conclusion, he says that actually, the supposed disappearance of black Argentines, which to be clear didn't happen, there's more black Argentines today than at any time in history, was actually so bad that it's worse than genocide, and we don't have an accurate word strong enough to... So it says that actually, the supposed disappearance of black Argentines, which to be clear didn't happen, there's more black Argentines today than at any time in history, was actually so bad that it's worse than genocide, and we don't have an accurate word strong enough to fucking describe it.
Not only
this video, near his conclusion, he says that actually, the supposed disappearance of black Argentines, which to be clear didn't happen, there's more black Argentines today than at any time in history, was actually so bad that it's worse than genocide, and we don't have an accurate word strong enough to fucking describe it.
Not only can we see that the way that black Argentinians disappeared was part of a massive centuries-long process of dehumanization of black people at a scale that is so strong and specific that genocide might not be a big enough word to describe it.
You know, there's no coherence here, obviously, because this guy doesn't know what he's saying. He's just jumping on a fucking trend. He's basically, you know, trying to appease both sides. Like, he wants to say that Argentina is racist enough, like on the same level of the USA, basically, to appease the Americans who have spent the last few months, like, trying to paint Argentina as the most racist country in human history, while also, hopefully, not going too far to offend the Argentines, who are pissed off at the way that those people have been wading into this topic so clumsily, despite not caring about Argentina ever before, except now to disparage it on social media. And I gotta say, I don't think he did a really good job, because it creates moments like this that are just a plain contradiction to what he has said elsewhere in the video, and that is frankly just ridiculous.
It wasn't because there wasn't Argentinians who didn't want to get rid of black people. Let me say that. And it wasn't because racism didn't exist in Argentina. It wasn't because, oh, there was integration. Everybody just held hands and got together. It was because structural, systemic racism stemming from the end of the transatlantic slave trade that was never addressed, and in fact was let to roam free, ended up in the Argentina we see today.
So the way that he frames this is that the black population as a percentage going down has to be the result of some sort of nefarious, like, racist campaign, even if it might not technically be correct to call it a genocide. And note the framing him there of, oh, it wasn't just that they all blended together and integrated and held hands and all that sort of thing. That's not what anyone is saying. No one is saying people held hands or whatever. What we're doing is largely making a comparison, particularly to the US, where there was extremely, extremely strong racial segregation, extremely strong systems of legally enforced racial privilege and racial disadvantage. Since Argentina didn't have that sort of system, not particularly because the leaders there were any better or worse than leaders anywhere morally, but rather because it was a very different social context that resulted in a very different situation, where people of different races, different origins, different whatever, were much more free to mix. And that sort of situation is naturally going to result in a population that is significantly less segregated, that is significantly less clearly racially delineated as that of a country like the United States. So what he said there, it's very clearly just a straw man, right? Oh, if you talk about the important influence that lack of segregation had, and the fact that today there's not a particularly clear and obvious black Argentine identity like there is a black American identity that's separate from everything else, you must be just saying that people were holding hands and stuff. No, we're simply acknowledging historical difference. And this is, again, why you have to talk about the actual differences in context between the two countries. Why you can't simply apply your framework one-to-one.
And later Argentina. But even if black genocide is not the most correct way to describe it necessarily, I will say that I don't take issue with people describing it as having been a genocide of black people, with people saying the Argentinian black genocide, even though I don't think it's the most correct way to say it because of the reasons I will now explain to you.
Here's some examples that he provides for why he understands when people say there was a black genocide in Argentina.
So, for instance, free black males 15 years or older had a mortality rate of 30%, while black male slaves had a mortality rate of 24%. Why was this the case? This is how it was written in the paper. In contrast, free black females had a mortality rate of 21%, while black female slaves had a mortality rate of 14%. It's a significant gap. This is because, you know how, like, if somebody has a really fucked up childhood where they grew up extremely poor, they're sex trafficked, they're out on the streets, and then they get off the streets, but they stay poor and they stay with very few resources, a lot of the times they end up having a really difficult life and dying young. So picture that happening to an entire population.
Now, this isn't particularly wrong as a general sort of thing, but in this specific case, in relation to the statistics that he's using there, it probably is very wrong. Let me explain. So his source for this is an article by Erica Denise Edwards, an American scholar who is
having a really difficult life and dying young. So picture that happening to an entire population.
Now, this isn't particularly wrong as a general sort of thing, but in this specific case, in relation to the statistics that he's using there, it probably is very wrong. Let me explain. So his source for this is an article by Erica Denise Edwards, an American scholar who is not the greatest to say the least, but she does at least do decent work every now and again. And this is an article from 2002, and since then she has revised a lot of her opinions on this sort of thing. So he's citing relatively old work from her, where she was making like a lot of conjectures based off relatively little information that she has since sort of revised a lot of her opinion on. We'll get into that more later. But the thing that he cites here is about mortality rates being higher for free blacks than they were for slaves. Now, her source for this is a 1976 paper, which itself is based on an 1823 census conducted in the city of Buenos Aires at the behest of the government there, which claims to have measured mortality, infant mortality, all this sort of thing. Now, in the first place, I would not exactly trust anything but like a head count. And even then, that's kind of iffy. From a government taking a census in 1823. The idea that they were counting like the mortality rate and the infant death rate and all of that sort of thing accurately is very, very iffy. This is something that they would not have had the capacity to do accurately back then, even if they wanted to. And the article that she cites for this, I think, provides very revealing context as to why the statistics here came out as they were. The author writes, I quote, "Explanations for the important difference in mortality rate between free and enslaved black people reflects only one possibility. The living conditions of the black population got worse once they were freed. This, which in principle is difficult to accept, makes more sense when we think about what the situation was like for black slaves in Buenos Aires. Many different travelers could never get tired of commenting about how well treated Buenos Aires slaves were. Among others, Buenos Aires. Many different travelers could never get tired of commenting about how well treated Buenos Aires slaves were. Among others, one traveler said, many would continue to be enslaved voluntarily if they could, not wanting to change anything about their conditions, nor leaving the service of their beloved masters who felt obliged to take care of them, whether they were sick or healthy." Now, that right there provides us a clue as to the reliability of these figures. The slave-owning population of Buenos Aires, who were the ones whose interest was obviously reflected by the people in power at the time. Clearly had motivations to manipulate these figures to make it look like continuing slavery was better, to make it look like freeing their slaves would make their lives worse. I mean, they had a propaganda industry talking about how wonderful they treated their slaves. So do you really think that when the census guy came around to check on how the free and unfree black people were doing, the results would have been represented accurately by the heads of the household? If not, the census itself would have been manipulated in first instance. You know, the elite of Buenos Aires were particularly aggressive in their demanding of the re-enslavement of black people. I cited in my video on racism in Argentina, for example, complaints by like the former slave owners of Buenos Aires about how after their domestic servant slaves were freed, they hired them as wage labor after that, and they're charging way too much money, so they should just be re-enslaved. You know, this is the sort of thing that was being published in the newspapers of the Buenos Aires elite back then. You know, with that sort of context, these people had a very vested interest in presenting the condition of freed slaves as being worse than that of continuously enslaved people. Now, what he says here about, you know, the conditions of people coming out of slavery if they don't receive any help aren't exactly going to be that great, and that is true, but in the case of Buenos Aires, it wasn't really that true. Because most of the slaves in Buenos Aires, upon being freed, they kept working for the same masters or some other master as domestic servants, and the conditions of their life, if anything, slightly improved because now they were being paid. So I want to move on to the typical talking points here that he addresses next. These are the two main talking points of this sort of racist Argentina TikTok trend. They committed genocide by, like, forcing black people into neighborhoods that were ridden by disease, and they all died to disease. And the other one is that they were sent to die disproportionately in wars.
Common. So they were siphoned into the poorest neighborhoods where disease, so to speak, ran rampant. Disease has killed many people in Argentina in general in the early 19th century, but the conditions in which blacks lived, this is what the paper says, oftentimes increased the likelihood of their dying from diseases such as cholera and salmonella. And even in the 1870s, yellow fever went rampant, and a lot of the victims, the majority of the victims, were poor black people.
Okay. So the person who wrote this paper, Erika Denise Edwards, has since done better research and no longer believes what she wrote there. As she wrote here in a later article from 2022, some argued that many black Argentines were unable to move out of heavily infected by epidemics areas of Buenos Aires due to their poverty, and they succumbed to disease. This too has been debunked, as data shows that outbreaks did not kill off the black population at higher rates than other populations. And he mentioned Andrews, that is George Reed Andrews, who wrote a book in 1983, I believe it was, where he was the first one to really look at the evidence for this and found absolutely none of it. If anything, he found evidence that disproved this idea. George Reed Andrews wrote already back then, Afro-Argentines do not seem to have had a special vulnerability to disease, and their allegedly heavy death rates during the epidemic cannot be documented through any source. So, something that this guy does here, and I mean, it's obvious, right? He didn't actually read most of the stuff that he's name-dropping here. It's been a week since his first video. How could he possibly have read all of these books and stuff that he claims to be citing here? He clearly didn't read George Reed Andrews, because George Reed Andrews contradicts him. Erika Denise Edwards, his own source for this claim, also contradicts him. You know, you can't just wade into this topic willy-nilly out of nowhere and speak about it authoritatively. So now he talks about the military talking point next. The, you know, they all died as cannon fodder talking point.
The thing to keep in mind is is the military aspect. So a lot of black people, particularly black men, in these conditions of poverty,
Как я тут оказался? Алёся! Алёся! Гарин.
旅の収穫だ。
В снежках много где есть особые тоннели, прокрытые снеговиками. Превратить в снежок, чтобы попасть в него, а затем вылететь с другой стороны. Типа портал! В снежках в многих местах ледовики проложили дороги, по которым снежки катятся намного быстрее. Почему ледовики так одержимы снежками? Потом скажет, потом окажется, те каинрийцы, они снеговики. И все снежанцы снеговики. Снежаняне. Снежнаняне. Друг рядом есть. Не, мне пофиг, я не буду этим заниматься.
さて。風向きに気をつけろ。よっ。よっ。風が立つぞ。飛ぶか。風向きに気をつけろ。
Львы. Ватаси камбаре.
死に急ぐとはな。吸引テスト開始。
倒れろ。両剣から逃げ切れるか。氷とともに
戻れ。安全距離。
当たれ。つがり思う存分。あれ狂う寒風よ。この世界も俺に応えているのか。
6308。
倒れる。これ。氷とともに。
先方開け。権限せよ。諸行無常。吸引テスト開始。
当たれ。両剣から逃げ切れる。出よこれ。凍結せよ。
戻れ。行ったまえ。ここにてね。安全距離。
倒れろ。行けつがり。
吸引テスト開始。
氷とともに。あれ狂う寒風よ。
生成ルテン。先方開け。権限。安全距離。
当たれ。両剣から逃げ切れるか。これ。はあ。銃の方が早い。つがり思う存分。
吸引テスト開始。我が名はドアクシンクになり。
凍結せよ。氷とともに。出よ。 アクセル全開。せい。加速するぞ。やっ。
悪夢の気配はないみたいだね。
から逃げ切れ。
たまえ、ここにて命じる。顔が曇ってるぞ。ガ 悪夢よ悪夢よ飛んでいけ手痛い一撃だ諸行無常
でこれ氷とともに打つだと当たれ
静まれ果てのない暗闇
We're like, well, I should make something of my life and try to move up in society. So if I can join the military, that could end up getting me a lot of resources. So a lot of black men joined the military. We'll talk about specifically who was using black soldiers the most. And because of that, a lot of black Argentinians in the 19th century were either at war or dying or dead. So in 1810, for every 100 black women, there were 107 black men in Argentina. By 1827, 17 years later, the ratio went to 69 black men for every 100 black women. It's a staggering drop.
So again here, Erica Denise Edwards later revised her opinion from the article that he's citing here, that he's using to imply that, you know, black Argentines died or were basically forced to die from disease or were used as cannon fodder in wars. And she stated here that perhaps the first and most popular of these myths has been that black men were used as cannon fodder, resulting in a massive death toll during wars throughout the 19th century. And she explains this by saying, but rather than dying on the battlefield, many simply deserted and opted not to return to their place of birth, as the historian George Reed Andrews has argued. You would think that Elliot Sang, given that he mentioned George Reed Andrews, might have actually read him to see this, right? Roll calls reveal that in 1829, the Afro-Argentine 4th Cazadores military unit lost 31 soldiers to death and 802 desertions. Another thing that Andrews mentions, by the way, is that whites also deserted in similar numbers. Some of those men relocated as far north as Lima, Peru. While some died and some departed, others returned home. Census data from Buenos Aires, Argentina's most populous city, reveal its African-descended population more than doubled in size from 1778 to 1836. Not exactly indicative of them sending a bunch of black people to die intentionally in wars, right? Now let's look at the main data point that he uses here for his argument that they disproportionately died in wars or were, forced onto the front line to disproportionately die in wars, which as of at least 2022, the author of the article that is citing as proof of this did not actually believe. Now, this is a particularly dishonest citation here because you will notice there that he talked about black men supposedly dying in the military, but his evidence of this isn't death rates of black men in the military, it's rather a drop in the gender ratio between black women and white men. Only in Buenos Aires, by the way, not in Argentina as a whole. And I think you can really tell that he was sort of trying to further a preconceived conclusion here because, if you want to prove how many people died in the military, you would go and look for how many of them actually died in the military. George Reed Andrews, again, who he cited, stated that although black males were drafted in numbers disproportionate to their representation in the population, it does not appear that they were singled out for consistently hazardous duty. It is true that the 7th and 8th Infantry Battalions eventually melted away to nothing during their years of campaigning, but the white units that accompanied them did know better. He then goes on to cite a bunch of examples of majority white units which suffered massive casualties, and other examples of majority black units that were left behind that were not even sent to the front during particularly bloody wars. For another example of the issues with an inference like this, the argument was made by a lot of people for many years, and maybe it still is today, that there is a genocide in Xinjiang, China. And one of the main points of evidence that they used for this, or did use for this, is that there was a drop in the birth rates. And they took this drop in the birth rates as proof of there having been like a mass sterilization campaign by the Chinese government. And that's the sort of thing that, like the argument that Elliot Sang used here, you know, the data that he used for his argument that black Argentines were supposedly sent to die in wars disproportionately, intentionally, you know, to eliminate them or whatever. There's no logical connection between those two things. You know, evidence for the fact that they were forcibly sterilizing people in Xinjiang Uyghurs would be direct evidence of them actually doing that. Looking at birth rates and saying, oh, this is what must be happening, that's an inference that does not necessarily follow. There are plenty of other potential explanations for why birth rates might drop, like, you know, birth rates tend to go down as people get richer. Just like there's plenty of other alternative explanations for why the gender ratio of black women and black men in Buenos Aires might have gone down at this time, beyond them being used as cannon fodder in wars. And we're going to be getting into those alternative explanations too, but I wanted to make this point because a lot of other people make this same sort of mistake, not just on this issue, but on many other issues, where they see a data point like this, and rather than asking the question of, well, why did this happen? Or is this data even accurate? They immediately jump to a hard conclusion that isn't actually at all substantiated by that data point. So Ulrika Denise Edwards' citation for that back in her 2002 article that Elliot Sang cited there is again George Reed Andrews. The example that she cited back then of black people supposedly being sent to die in wars was the Battle of Sipe Sipe, where, according to her, 1,000 Afro-Argentines were killed, captured, or wounded. But in the passage that I cited there from George Reed Andrews, he says, no casualty counts are available for the disaster at Sipe Sipe, but a list of officers killed and captured suggests that the mainly white 9th Infantry suffered more heavily than the two black regiments combined. The 9th lost 15 officers, while the 6th and 7th between them lost 6. So Sipe Sipe was not simply a disaster for black Argentine troops, it was a disaster for white Argentine troops as well. But Ulrika Denise Edwards there left out that comparison, and to be clear here, she cites Andrews frequently on this page, so she must have known this. It's just dishonest framing to leave out that context. Now, the source that Ulrika Denise Edwards cites for this drop in the gender ratio among the black population is George Reed Andrews. But George Reed Andrews does not frame this as some sort of example of a nefarious campaign of like black people dying off or whatever, or them being killed in wars or whatever. His explanation for this is actually rather different. What he says is that in the censuses in Buenos Aires of around 10 years later, there were 2 of them, and they actually reported the largest black population that had ever been registered in the city up until that point. And his conclusion, based on these clear inconsistencies, is quite simply that this decline of the black community just didn't actually happen except on paper. The census data was incomplete and things like that. And when it comes to black people in the Argentine military, along with people in the Argentine military in general, desertion rates were way higher than deaths, both among whites and blacks. And this is a big problem with this sort of very amateur historical research, is that people look back on this stuff and they assume that what's presented on paper reflects the actual real reality of the everyday people. That simply wasn't really the case. You know, when people talk about the disappearance of the black Argentines or whatever, which apparently happened in like a genocide in the mid-19th century, it's simply not something that was ever actually reflected in reality. Because whatever official documents said, they do not reflect the reality of everyday life. For example, as George Reed Andrews said, the frequency with which Afro-Argentines appear in random newspaper and magazine photographs of the period is truly startling. You know, you have black Argentines frequently appearing in newspaper photographs and stuff like that well into the 20th century. It's not that they weren't there, because they are. It's just that as a proportion of the population, as a result of mass Spanish and Italian migration at the end of the 19th century and onwards, as a proportion of the population, their share went down. Now, obviously, there was certainly racism, but it was not the sort of like legal apartheid system that the United States had. And that's the main contention here, right? It's like a bunch of Americans are coming in to paint Argentina as the most racist, worstest country in the world. But what people are saying in response to that isn't that there's literally no racism in the history of Argentina. What we're saying is the history of Argentina is nowhere near as bad as the like United States' history that you're trying to project onto it. And I think a good way to emphasize that is with the way that he like flippantly treats the very clear differences in Argentine history to that of the United States and like hand waves them away. Like here, for example, when he mentioned Rosas. who was president of Argentina in the first half of the 19th century, or mainly of Buenos Aires, more so than the rest of Argentina because there was a civil war. But he was overwhelmingly popular among normal working class people who were mostly black or brown.
And it's complex, but what you start to see is that even in the cases where there was some, let's say, more progressive attitude towards black folks in Argentina at this time, it was mainly under one particular caudillo, and mainly because they were able to serve as military, which gave him an advantage. This caudillo was the previously mentioned Juan Manuel de Rosas, who has again been considered a tyrant.
Being considered a tyrant by who? That's a question that I think is an important thing to ask, because the people, ironically, who rewrote history to make Juan Manuel de Rosas look like he was a tyrant were the racist elite, the rather racist faction of the elite, because there were some elites who weren't nearly as racist as them, who he mercilessly oppressed. So he was a tyrant for them, but he wasn't a tyrant for the vast majority of people. So this is him repeating again an Argentine right-wing narrative of him being a tyrant or whatever.
He was a caudillo who won numerous civil wars, who was in charge of Buenos Aires for a long time, briefly was in charge of Argentina. And one of the reasons why he was successful as a general was because he recognized that if he appealed to the black people of Buenos Aires, that they would fight for him, and that would give him a man advantage, and it would give him a loyalty advantage.
And this, regardless of Rosas's motivations, is still a really good example of the difference in the context between Argentina and the United States. Because the simple fact that it was even possible in this society, and this was in the 1830s, by the way, for a politician to draw a huge part of their legitimacy from appealing to black people indicates a massively different context to that of the United States. This is something that would not have been imaginable in the United States until like the late 20th century, basically. So what you can glean from that is quite clearly that the Spanish colonial system resulted in a very different situation to that of the United States. One where, even in the early 19th century, non-white people were a legitimate political force from which leaders could be afforded legitimacy. This is something that did not exist in the United States. The United States had a much more rigid legal caste system, where the interests of non-white people were literally totally ignored, and they were completely excluded from society. Now, Rosas was subsequently cast as like the ultimate evil of Argentine history by the racist faction of the elites, and not simply because he gained support from black people and brown people, but also because he represented a real threat to their class interests. And this is the way that he frames Rosas, which is just plainly untrue.
Black population was underserved. It faced tremendous racism, and black men were being depleted because they were being enlisted in wars, mostly under Rosas, who was appealing to the black population with small concessions while ultimately using their bodies to win wars as a caudillo.
That simply did not happen. Obviously, Rosas was self-interested, as any leader, especially of this time, would have been, but he derived a large part of his popularity from the black population, from the working class in general, really, because for whatever the reason was, he did actually treat them like human beings. He did actually contemplate their interests for the first time in a substantial way since Argentina became independent. But again, the defense of Rosas is not that he was perfect, it's not that he wasn't self-interested, because he was. It's rather, what does this indicate about Argentine society at this time, and later as well, indeed? It's that black people were a political force to be reckoned with. They were a substantial part of the working class whose interests had to be seriously contemplated by the elite, something that is markedly different from the United States and indicates an extremely different historical context. And this is a context that Elliot Sang repeatedly misses in this video. For example, he mentions José de San Martín, who was the leader of Chilean and Peruvian independence, who was Argentine. And it really seems evident to me here that he tried to find some way to call José de San Martín racist, but couldn't find it. So he just tried to slyly link him to broader tendencies among the Latin American elite at the time, and basically segues into talking about Simón Bolívar, who was not Argentine, as far as I know, never stepped foot in Argentina, to try and make San Martín seem racist by associating him with Bolívar as if they were the same person.
Know this, and some of you will know some of this history and some of you might not. This is José de San Martín. Jose de San Martin is known as the liberator of Argentina, Chile, and Peru. He was a very famous general who led and won multiple battles against Spain in the process of independence. The reason I'm bringing him up is because Jose de San Martin is recorded as an Argentine general. I mean, nobody gets more Argentinian than San Martin, right? And we can get into a lot of the legacy of San Martin, but the only reason I'm bringing him up is because if you know his biography, it showcases something important about what Argentinian and what Chilean and Paraguayo and South American means. His parents were both Spanish. Jose de San Martin was, if he was born now, we would say he's Spanish. Your parents are Spanish. And he was born in colonial Spain. And so what that means is San Martin is what we would call a criollo.
So he goes on to bring up Simon Bolivar, segues into talking about him as another example of a criollo.
This is a great example, right, of why the criollo thing is important. So I thank you for that question. Simón Bolívar, the father of independence of Latin America, one of the most important figures in American history, world
The top half of Latin America, maybe.
history. Simón Bolívar was a criollo. His family was of Spanish lineage. I believe his parents were born in what would be today's Venezuela. They were born in the New World, and or he was born in the New World. Simón Bolívar, infamously or famously, depending on who you ask, was getting his butt kicked, and his men were getting their butt kicked early on in the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. And so who did Simón Bolívar call when he needed support to fight these wars for independence against Spain? He called Alexandre Pétion. He called the Haitians. Haiti, the newly formed independent country. Haiti, that was trying to get its own priorities in order as they were being blockaded by the rest of the world. What did Haiti do? They said, we will send you fighters. We will send you arms. We will send you support. The only thing we ask is that you abolish slavery. You free the slaves. That's the only thing we ask. So the Haitians participate. They help fight with Simón Bolívar. They help fight for Spanish-American independence wars. Simón Bolívar ends up being the leader of a conflagration of multiple different later Latin American countries. And does Simón Bolívar free the slaves? No. He freed some slaves and offered basically some concessions to black folks in South America and Latin America. And then as black folks were fighting against his government, then
Now, this is true. Simón Bolívar absolutely betrayed Haiti and betrayed the black people he had told them that he would free. But the thing is, this video is about Argentina. Simón Bolívar was not Argentine. San Martin was Argentine. So the segue from talking about San Martin into talking about Bolívar is very slight. Because San Martin was not Bolívar. In fact, they clashed so much that San Martin ended up exiling himself after a meeting with Bolívar and never returned to South America. And seeing this part is where it became very evident to me that he was desperately trying to avoid saying like anything even comparatively positive about Argentina and its differing history with race. Because San Martin is someone who there's no record of him ever even saying anything racist, let alone doing anything racist. Something that, you know, if you're an American is going to be unthinkable in regards to your independence figures. And again, this is not because San Martin was like some sort of particularly virtuous person or whatever. It's because he occupied a very different context. For San Martin to be able to succeed as a political leader, he had to appeal to brown and black people who at the time were the majority in the country. Still, there's no record of him even being racist in private, which I guess is to his personal credit, but nonetheless, the fact that he has to talk about Bolivar to sort of slyly imply there's something negative about San Martin, I think is very interesting and very indicative of how he's approaching this from a preconceived sort of conclusion. And this is sort of the way that he decided to slyly imply that the Argentine independence leaders were racist. And you know, like as he said, there's no difference between the US and the Argentine or the Latin American context, etc. But San Martin is a great example of how there is a lot of difference. So I went over this in more detail in my dedicated main channel video on the history of racism in Argentina, but where San Martin exercised political power, which he did after he assisted in the liberation of Peru from the Spanish, he immediately abolished all racial laws. In Peru, San Martin immediately abolished all racial classifications and declared that any slave who entered entered Peru would be freed, though he did unfortunately fall short of abolishing slavery because he was afraid of confronting Peru's very powerful landowners who had been put in that position by the Spanish colonial system. Another important thing to mention here that also demonstrates big differences of who entered Peru, he abolished all racial laws. In Peru, San Martin immediately abolished all racial classifications and declared that any slave who entered Peru would be freed, though he did unfortunately fall short of abolishing slavery because he was afraid of confronting Peru's very powerful landowners who had been put in that position by the Spanish colonial system. Another important thing to mention here that also demonstrates big differences in context in the history of Argentina and indeed Latin America and the American context is the Inca plan, which was a plan that was supported by San Martin alongside other very important Argentines would be freed, though he did unfortunately fall short of abolishing slavery because he was afraid of confronting Peru's very powerful landowners who had been put in that position by the Spanish colonial system. Another important thing to mention here that also demonstrates big differences in context in the history of Argentina and indeed Latin America and the American context is the Inca plan, which was a plan that was supported by San Martin alongside other very important Argentine independence leaders like Manuel Belgrano and Martin de Güemes to restore the Incan monarchy and have an Incan monarch rule over most of southern South America. So this was in the early 19th century, and you had a bunch of important leaders of Argentine independence who very seriously wanted to be ruled by an indigenous monarch. This again, who rule over most of southern South America. So this was in the very important Argentine independence leaders like Manuel Belgrano and Martin de Güemes to restore the Incan monarchy and have an Incan monarch rule over most of southern South America. So this was in the early 19th century, and you had a bunch of important leaders of Argentine independence who very seriously wanted to be ruled by an indigenous monarch. This again demonstrates a very different context to the United States context, where very distinct from being willing to subsume themselves to the authority of an indigenous monarch, there was no place in American society at all for indigenous people. None. It's quite clearly a very different context with very different dynamics that you can't pertain to understand and be talking really smugly about after just a week of researching Wikipedia articles and skimming outdated articles by scholars that have since changed their views. And there's further stuff in here that shows, the need to understand Latin America and even Argentina on its own terms.
Going with the genocide. So let's go back to Julio Argentino Roca, let's go back to Domingo Sarmiento. They were part of a group called the Generation of 80, the Generación del 80. They became the governing elite in Argentina from 1880 to 1916. Again, a lot of white people. They represented a generation that brought forth...
I want to note here that the Generation of 80 is notorious, and before this as well, since the fall of Rosas basically, the Buenos Aires elite who controlled the country, past that point, they did so by basically disenfranchising the entire rest of the population. It was just like a rotating dictatorship. So this was not like a democracy. It was not like a white democracy, at least like in the US, where white people could vote in the US and they voted for their own interests and stuff like that to oppress others, blah, blah, blah. In Argentina, no one could vote. In Argentina, the dynamic was always much more agricultural elite versus everyone else. Much more so than it being like a race thing, so like in the US, where white people was genuinely given something to lose legally and materially. We're going to get more into that in a minute. But important to note here, again, these people were in power as a result of pure dictatorship. There was no democracy in Argentina at all until arguably the 1940s, though most would say in the 1910s is when the first flourish of Argentine democracy came.
Or a specific, progressive, so to speak, and imperialist and capitalist explosion in Argentina. They are, again, founding fathers of Argentina.
I mean, no, that's just wrong. The founding...
Fake, progressive, so to speak, and imperialist and capitalist explosion in Argentina. They are, again, founding fathers of Argentina.
I mean, no, that's just wrong. The founding fathers of Argentina, I mean, they don't really use that term, but if they're were any, it would be San Martin, Güemes, Belgrano, those sorts of guys. Basically the ones who fought for independence, not these ones who came like 70 years later, man. It sounds it kind of sounds like he's like overplaying how popular these figures are, because they are very controversial. They do not have like wide support like the US founding fathers do, like San Martin and Belgrano, for example, do. The only people who really celebrate the leaders of this period are like very right-wing people. You know, these people were like the representatives of the Unitarian faction of Argentine politics versus the Federalist faction, which Ross was a representative of. And they were much less inclusive. You know, there was like a massive, like century-long power struggle, and indeed like the cultural battle between what the Unitarians and the Federalists represented is still going on today. Like the Federalists were much more inclusive in general, appealed much more to people of all races, had much more so-called progressive politics, whereas the Unitarians, who these guys were way more elitist, like liberals who look towards like the US as an incredible model to follow, who, you know, mostly wanted to perpetuate, appealed much more to people of all today. Like the Federalists were much more inclusive in general, appealed much more to people of all races, had much more so-called progressive politics, whereas the Unitarians, who these guys were way more elitist, like liberals who look towards like the US as an incredible model to follow, who, you know, mostly wanted to perpetuate their own land ownership and wealth and their own interests at the expense of really everyone else. So him framing them as like the founding fathers, you know, he really comes off to me as something that he's doing, because the actual more founding father figures like San Martin and Belgrano were not nearly as clearly racist as he needs them to be for the narrative that is going for here.
And that included Roca, it included Sarmiento. And the reason I bring them back up is because, just briefly, I want to talk about what happens in Argentina in this period. So Argentina, by 1940 or so, was seen as on pace to become the United States of Latin America, economically. Again, really funny considering what y'all say about Americans now.
What the fuck?
If you also have heard that Buenos Aires was considered the Paris of Latin America, this factors into that. Argentina grew tremendously in its economy and had this sort of golden age between the mid to late 1800s and the early 1900s, excuse me. And because of this, there is a sort of fondness about this history.
Okay, so this is completely untrue. I actually have a very long video about this. This is a pure right-wing myth. I have a long main channel video on this, you know, because when you're actually genuinely interested in a topic, rather than just jumping on a social media trend, you tend to have like an archive that you can fall back on, like I can here. So I have this video here called Argentina Was Never, because when you're actually genuinely interested in a right-wing myth, I have a long main channel video on this, you know, because when you're actually genuinely interested in a topic, rather than just jumping on a social media trend, you tend to have like an archive that you can fall back on, like I can here. So I have this video here called Argentina Was Never Rich, the myth of economic decline, that debunks this idea. But the gist of it is that Argentina was never rich because its supposed wealth was pretty much exclusively concentrated in the hands of the aristocratic, oligarchical, agricultural elite who had inherited land from the Spanish system. And again, this is important to talk about because there's huge differences between the Spanish colonial system and the British colonial system that resulted in this. Because, you know, you don't develop a country by exporting agricultural produce and just concentrating all the profit from that in your own hands. Basically, no one got the benefit from this except the elites. And this contrasts to the American, because yes, the Argentine elite owned land that was stolen via native genocide or theft or whatever. However, the difference between Argentina and the US is said concentration of the land. The Spanish and subsequently the Argentine elite governments did not give people land to own. The United States did. The United States basically said, if you are white, you are materially invested in our genocide of the indigenous peoples because you can get land out of the deal, stuff like the Homestead Act, for example. In Argentina, there was no real material reason for the white immigrants who came there to join up with the white elite like there was in the US. They were not incentivized to become racist by like an official legal system that gave them benefits and privileges that weren't afforded to other people on a racial basis, and at the expense expense of others, like, you know, that land being stolen from Native Americans and given to them literally. Instead, in Argentina, the land was concentrated in very, very few hands as a result of the Spanish colonial system and held by them. And in fact, when Argentina did do indigenous genocide post-independence, for example, the most famous example being the conquest of the desert, all of the land that was conquered went to those same families, the same oligarchs who already owned all the land elsewhere. Because the way that conquest worked was basically, it was funded via the investment of those Argentine elites. You know, they paid for the conquest and essentially pre-bought the land that would be conquered and stolen by a genocide. So of the land that was stolen during the conquest of the desert, 42 million hectares of it were allocated by the government to only 1,843 owners, all of whom had links to the government that were either economic or familial. So this quite clearly was extremely different to the sort of colonialism that was going on in the US around this same time and earlier. The Argentine landowning elite were basically just interested in getting more and more and more wealth for themselves. So this was nothing like what happened in the US, where smaller parcels of land were given out to white people to give them something to lose in the system. And it's a very good example of what I've been talking about here. And this is the crux of the issue here, that you have to understand the different colonial context between Latin America and the US. Is this result of the differences in the colonial system, which resulted in very different class interests? And I'm not just saying this for like a moral reason, like, oh, the white people in Argentina were so much nicer than the white people in the US. No. The white people in Argentina, as a result of factors outside of their control, had interests that were much more aligned with those of the indigenous people, of the black people, etc., than with those of the white elite in their country, because they were not given anything to lose by them, like white people in the US were more broadly. That's the most important thing to understand here. It's going to be more important later.
But as we've talked about, that history was based on indigenous genocide. It was also based in capitalist expansion based on indigenous genocide. As an example, right, how did the economy grow? Well, it grew because of agricultural exports. It was an export-led boom, right? Again, we're just using Wikipedia as like a model to do a brief presentation, but I encourage you to read Argentinian historians. If you would rather talk with a historian about history, I urge you to do that. Why don't you talk with Fernanda Peñalosa, based in Sydney, but is Argentinian, about the histories of racism in Argentina? Why don't you read Enrique Dussel? Why don't you read Tulio Alperín Dongui? I encourage you. Argentina was, you know...
Do you notice the smugness there? Like, he's like, oh, don't worry, there's plenty of people who have said everything that I've said here and they all 100% agree with me. But this is someone who literally started reading about the topic a week ago. Do you think he's read them? Do you think he knows what they say? Or do you think he's just throwing out a bunch of names smugly with this massive undue confidence, as if he knows what he's talking about and as if what he's talking about is just sort of self-evidently true because he named up a few people? I'm telling you right now, he hasn't read shit from any of those people. He just went and found some names to give like him just uncritically parroting a right-wing narrative of Argentine historical prosperity here a faux sense of legitimacy. Like, I genuinely am kind of gobsmacked at this sort of attitude where it's like, oh, you think I'm wrong about this? Well, why don't you read the works by name that I've never read myself, but I know that I'm fucking correct here. I started learning about this topic a week ago. Of course I'm fit to like talk to you with this sort of overconfident smugness. Like, I don't like the idea that you can't talk about another country just because you're not from there. But I do think you need to actually fucking learn about it, honestly. And talking like this, like, oh, you think what I'm saying isn't correct? Well, what about these other people who so confident smugness? Like, I don't like the idea that you can't talk about another country just because you're not from there. But I do think you need to actually fucking learn about it, honestly. And talking like this, like, oh, you think what I'm saying isn't correct? Well, what about these other people who certainly 100% agree with everything that I'm saying here? Though I've never actually read them, obviously. I just started learning about this thing a week ago. Now let me tell you all about the history of your country, which I didn't give a single shit about until it was trending on social media. Like, he's acting like he knows fucking everything about a topic that he just started thinking about for the first time a week before he made this video, when he made another video that was so bad he had to delete it. And now he's acting so smug and condescending. Come on, man.
Economic aspect, because I sometimes hear this conflation too. When you criticize Argentinians sometimes online, I got some comments from that last video that I...
Isn't it just so weird, like, when you criticize Argentinians, like, why are you just suddenly coming out to criticize Argentinians just when it so happens to be that there's like a mass psychosis resulting from the World Cup of a bunch of ignorant Americans just saying dumb shit about Argentina just because they see others saying it on social media, right? Criticizing Argentinians, that's such a weird framing too.
Ended up taking down. They're basically like, how dare you criticize Argentinians when we have this going on in Patagonia right now? When U.S.
I mean, it is a great thing to talk about. Like, why are you only talking about Argentina to like disparage it and like paint it as like a hotbed of international racism or whatever, without ever having spoken about the long history of American imperialism against Argentina? You know, your country's imperialist paint.
Вот, а я не выспался сегодня.